All right, let us pray. Father, teach us your word, help us to love it and obey it, so that we may be full of your joy and overflowing to a hurting and lost world. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, now I had hoped today that we would have done chapters 12 and 13, and this morning we didn't. The topic got very interesting, and we went into talking, still pertaining to the topic, but there were questions being asked and so forth. So depending on how many questions you ask, you may have a short class or equally as a long class, but I'm only going to touch on chapter 12 today, since I like to keep the two classes together, and I don't like to be like, crisscrossing and seesawing and don't remember where I stopped the last one. So we'll just look at
Yeah. I said keep your brain on task too. So.
Yes, right. Yeah. So we'll just look at chapter 12 today. And I'll just ask for two readers today. One person can read from chapter 12, verses 1 to 8, and then a second person from 9 to 21. Who wants to read?
Not me. I'm coughing. I've got allergies, so I'm not going to do it.
Okay.
I'll read 1 to 8.
You'll read 1 to 8, Marilyn. Who will read 9 to 21?
I'll do that.
You'll do that, Lorraine? Oh, yeah. Okay. You want to go, Linda? Oh, unmute yourself, Linda. Oh, okay. Lorraine said that she will. Okay, that's fine. Okay. Go ahead, Marilyn.
Okay. So then, my brothers, because of God's great mercy to us, I appeal to you. Offer yourselves as a living sacrifice to God, dedicated to his service and pleasing to him. This is the true worship that you should offer. Do not conform yourself to the standards of this world, but let God transform you inwardly by a complete change of your mind. Then you will be able to know the will of God, what is good and is pleasing to him and is perfect. And because of God's gracious gift to me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you should. Instead, be modest in your thinking and judge yourself according to the amount of faith that God has given you. We have many parts in the one body, and all these parts have different functions. In the same way, though we are many, we are one body in union with Christ, and we are all joined to each other as different parts of one body. So we are to use our different gifts in accordance with the grace that God has given us. If our gift is to speak God's message, we should do it according to the faith that we have. If it is to serve, we should serve. If it is to teach, we should teach. Did you want me to do 8 also?
Yes, right down to the end of 8.
Okay, if it is to encourage others, we should do so. Whoever shares with others should do it generously. Whoever has authority should work hard. Whoever shows kindness to the others should do it cheerfully.
All right. Lorraine?
Love in all sincerity, loathing evil and clinging to the good. Let love for our brotherhood breed warmth of mutual affection. Give pride of place to one another in esteem. With unflagging energy and ardor of spirit, serve the Lord. Let hope keep you joyful, in trouble stand firm. Persist in prayer, contribute to the needs of God's people, and practice hospitality. Call down blessings on your persecutors, blessings, not curses. With the joyful be joyful, and mourn with the mourners. Care as much about each other as about yourselves. Do not be haughty, but go about with humble folk. Do not keep thinking how wise you are. Never pay back evil for evil. Let your aims be such as all men count honorable. If possible, so far as it lies with you, live at peace with all men. My dear friends, do not seek revenge, but leave a place for divine retribution. For there is a text which reads, "Justice is mine, says the Lord, I will repay." But there is another text, "If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. By doing this, you will heap live coals on his head." Do not let evil conquer you, but use good to defeat evil.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you, Marilyn. Okay. Now, today, we begin a section of the book of the letter to the Romans that speaks about Paul giving practical advice to the Christians at Rome. And we're going to see this in the next 4 chapters of Romans, chapters 12, 13, 14, and 15, where Paul has already explained the gospel in the last 11 chapters, and now he's giving practicum. So it isn't all words. Now he's telling you how you need to put the gospel into action. And so there's a practical application of all that he has previously said in this letter. And so what he's doing is that he's describing how Christians should live in the world. And he's given advice about our attitudes, what our attitudes should be, and how a Christian should behave toward other Christians and towards his enemies and toward people in general. And he will also in these chapters get into talking about the relationship Christian will have with the state and its laws, which will come up in the next chapter, chapter 13. And he would also write about responsibilities, how a Christian is responsible to people whose faith is weak. And you'll see that in chapter 14. And then he will, in chapter 15, he writes about himself, and he writes about his work as an apostle and what his plans are, and he requests the prayers of the faithful. So we are going to see the whole practical application that Paul gives to the Christians at Rome in these next 4 chapters, having already explained the gospel to them. And the first thing he starts off on this whole topic of being living sacrifices, but really and truly what he's addressing is what true worship is about. And he says in verses 1 and 2, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good and pleasing and perfect will. And so here we have Paul is speaking to the people, to the Christians in the church at Rome, and he is saying that if they are to have a right attitude to God, then they also need to think rightly about themselves, and the whole notion. And by having such a relationship with God and having a right attitude toward God and a right attitude and thinking rightly about themselves, that it will also make a difference to the relationships that they have with other people. So it starts, Paul says, from God. And so he says to them that we need to offer our bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, which is our spiritual worship. And if you remember, in our Book of Common Prayer in the Eucharist, I periodically quote this when it comes to the offertory sentence. Like when I say, and the one that is more familiar to everyone is, I say, walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself an offering and sacrifice to God. However, there's also the one which speaks of by the mercies of God, offer yourselves as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. That's another one of the offertory sentences. So if you have a Book of Common Prayer, you can go and look them up, and you'll see a whole set of them, and they're there. And this is one thing I always say to folks about the Episcopal Church, that a lot of the things we say, people don't realize there are biblical verses in the Eucharist. It is very biblically based. So when people come tell you, oh, the Eucharist this or that, it is biblically based. And so that is one of our offertory sentences just before communion, before the celebration of the Eucharist. And Paul is saying here, that is what true worship is. And he uses the motif, he uses the analogy of a priest who offers a sacrifice. In the Old Testament, priests would offer sacrifices to God, and the animal had to be a perfect animal without blemish and spot or so forth. And so you wanted an animal that will be pleasing to God, because it goes back to this whole notion of the first fruits were offered to God, not the scrapings or the scraps, the first fruits, the best. And so Paul is saying, is using this whole motif, this whole analogy of a priest offering sacrifice. But at this point in time, our bodies are not the sacrifice, as in terms of, he's not writing about death. What he's explaining is how Christians are to live in the world, how we are to see ourselves in relation to God and in relation to others. And so
does he mean, sorry, that's me. Does
that's
he
right.
mean you give your whole body? I mean, you give your body and your mind to Christ?
You offer your body, your soul, your mind, everything. That is how we are to experience worship. Oftentimes, as I told the group this morning, we go to worship and we always go as what we can get out of worship. And that's not why we worship. We go to worship to hear if we like the songs, the hymns, and if the sermon is good, and we can be in fellowship with, and we can be in fellowship with others. That is not true worship. True worship is to deal with our relationship with God. When we go when we come together, when the church gathers together, it gathers together to give honor and praise and glory and worship to God. That's what it is meant to do. First and foremost, that's what we are doing. And so in order for us to do that, Paul is saying to us that when we come for worship, we come as bodies that are living sacrifices, bodies in which how we should be living out in the world, bodies in which God expects us to be, to offer our worship to God, and that it will be and that we will be offering ourselves as holy and pleasing to God, which is our spiritual act of worship. And so as Paul is saying, worship here is not just a ceremony. It's not just what we do on Sundays. It is a whole spiritual thing. It is worship that God asks for. And so when we go to worship, Paul is saying we are worshiping God, not trying to be, it is not about seeing what we can get out of it. It is first and foremost what we are offering to God. What we get out of it is secondary and not primary. And that is what Paul is saying here in verses 1 and 2. So the first thing Paul is saying in our terms of the practice of our relationship with God is how we worship him and how we offer ourselves to worship him. So that's the first thing. And then he goes on and he says in verse 2, he says, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And here, what Paul is saying is that Christians need to change the way that they think, and they need to realize that as Christians, we are not to be copying everything that people in the world do. Yes, it is easy to do that because we are so much bombarded with it. But what we need to realize is that we, as Christians, we belong to God's world. And so we are expected to behave in a different way from people who are not Christians. And we are supposed to behave differently yes, from people who are not Christians. We are to behave differently in the world. And Jesus himself said, that we are to be in the world, but not of the world. And that's the same point that Paul is hammering home here, that we are not to conform to the pattern of this world, but
What
be
is it?
transformed.
Sorry. What does he mean by test? It says you'll be able to test and approve God's. What is God's will? How do we test?
Say that again. That what?
It says you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. At least that's how mine words it.
Yes. And what he's saying here is that what we do in terms when we have transformed, when we have changed, then we will start to see in a greater light who God is and what God expects of us. And we could only, and this goes back to even sometimes we wonder, why doesn't God reveal things to us as he did in days of old? But he does. But we have to be in that frame of mind and in a relationship with him to help do that. God reveals more to people who have let me put this a different way. The stronger your relationship with God, the more he will reveal to you. If you do not have a strong relationship with God, then God will not reveal that much to you. It goes back to the whole notion of I think it was Paul who talks about still feeding on milk instead of solid food. If we are in the stage of milk and we are Christians, and I think Paul must see, I think he gets to that maybe in this one too, in this book. But where if we are Christians who are weak and only can feed on baby's milk, then that's all we will get. As we grow in our faith and we can eat solid food, then we will get solid food. So in the same way, God will reveal to us what we can take, what we allow him to reveal to us. His revelation to us depends on our relationship with him and our spirituality. So here, if we are more renewing of our minds, if we are more going God's way, being in a stronger relationship with God, then we will get to know what is God's will, what is God's purpose for us. That's a question we always ask ourselves. What's God's purpose for me in this world? And so Paul is saying, you got to stop conforming to the world and get more in tune with God. And that's how you will learn more about what your purpose, what God's will is.
Okay.
Yes. And then we go on to verses 3-6, and it gets into a part of the chapter that we are quite familiar with. It says, for by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the measure of faith God has given you. Just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we who are many form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace given us. If a man's gift is prophesying, let him use it in proportion to his faith. If it is serving, let him serve. If it is teaching, let him teach. If it is encouraging, let him encourage. If it is contributing to the needs of others, let him give generously. If it is leadership, let him govern diligently. If it is showing mercy, let him do it cheerfully. And so what Paul does here is that he's saying that we are to use the gifts, the talents, the skills, whatever you want to call it, that God has given to us as Christians. We are to use our gifts for the greater whole. But before he starts off, you see in verse 3, it says, For by the grace given you, I say to every one of you. And when you hear these words, I say to every one of you, you know that Paul is about to say something very important. And if you remember, you might remember the old translation and not the newer translation now, but in the old translation, when Jesus wanted to say something that was very important, and in the old translation, he used to say, verily, verily, I say unto you. You remember those words? Verily, verily, I say unto you. That's when Jesus wanted to say something that was very important. That meant, I want you to really listen and heed this, take this in. And so Paul is saying here, I say to every one of you, which is a similar kind of introduction as to what he's going to say. So he's saying, this is important. And the first thing he says, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought. In other words, be humble. Be humble. Practice humility. But rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the measure of faith God has given you. So he's saying that Christians are to be humble, because what you have comes from God, and therefore it is nothing that you have gained on your own. It is that they came from God, and so what Paul is saying is telling Christians to think properly about their skills. They're not to be proud. They're not to think that they're better than other people. And not only that, if not that they're better, not that they're to think that they're better than any other people, but also too, not to think that the gifts that you have been given is better than any other person. And this is something that Paul talks about and he uses the human body. And he says, the human, he says, just as each of us has one body with many, many members. And as Paul has written elsewhere, he says, the eye can't say the ear has no need of you. And the same, because we all need all the members of our body, our human body, to function effectively. And what Paul is saying is that the church needs all of its members with their many gifts to function effectively. No one's gift is better or superior to the other. And that is what Paul is saying here. And we always like to make those kind of distinctions. And Paul is saying, nah. He says here, just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ, we who are many form one body, which is the church, and each member belongs to all the others. We need each other to function effectively, to function properly. That is what he's saying here. And he even goes on to say in verse 6, we have different gifts according to the grace given us. And so what he's talking about here is that our gifts come from God, and that we have special skills, and that Christians should use them. And he starts and he mentions some of these gifts that we have. He says, as we read in beginning of verse 6, we have different gifts according to the grace given us. If a man's gift is prophesying, let him use it in proportion to his faith. So he's going to now start outlining 7 gifts. He mentions 7 gifts which we can use, and which we are and which we should allow, that Christians should have and should be able to use and to function for the benefit of others. Our gifts are never to be used for our own benefit. They are to be always, 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 always used for the benefit of others. And so, when Paul talks about prophecy, he's saying a Christian may receive a message from God, and that Christian should give that message, should pass on that message to others, to the local church, to others. But the only way that message could be passed on correctly or rightly or justly is if that person who is given the message has faith. And so that's why he says, let him use it in proportion to his faith. So Paul is saying, when it comes to prophecy, you have to realize that the message that you're passing on truly comes from God. So you have to trust God in order for that to take place. So when we hear about prophecy, obviously you must have some relationship, some reading of the Bible in order for that to take place. And then he continues and he says, if it is serving, let him serve. So the word serve comes, as I so told the others this morning, and Deacon Allen was there, it comes from the word diakonai, which means deacon. A deacon is a servant, and so it comes from that Greek word to serve. Deacons are servants, and for example, the apostles served when they were preaching. That was their service. Other people serve in various other ways. There were other disciples whose service was giving food to the poor and to poor widows and that sort of thing. And Acts chapter 6 speaks about that. So in other words, we are all to use whatever gifts we have been given to serve other folks. And it isn't that we are all going to be doing the same thing, or that someone's gift or someone's service is worse than another or better than another. No, it's not. Then he says, if it is teaching, let him teach. So obviously, when we're trying to learn God's word, we need someone to teach us, and we need to learn what the meaning of our faith is in our daily lives, and so we need some person to teach. I also said to the others this morning, I was saying to them that in the ordination rite for a priest, in our examination, it says that a presbyter, they use the term presbyter, which is the same thing like priest, but it uses the word presbyter, and it says a presbyter is called to work as a priest, pastor, and teacher. Those are the three major things that priests are meant to do. Pastor, meaning to care for the faithful. A priest, meaning to celebrate the Mass, the Eucharist, and to stand in that position. And as a teacher, as I said to them, which is what I'm doing right now. So, and I say the same thing to you. And that is the three major things a priest is called to do when we're being ordained. So I just wanted to share that with you. So you need people to teach, you need people to pass on the meaning of the faith and what it's about and how we're to live it out in our daily lives and so forth. And so to teach. If it is encouraging, let him encourage. And this term encourage can mean two things. It can either mean persuading, so encouraging by persuading how we are to live, or it could be encouraging by comforting, giving comfort to someone or giving courage to someone. And so that is another way you can do that. And even this morning in my reflection, I was talking about Barnabas, who was the son of encouragement, the son of consolation, and that he was known among the first Christians because of the way he encouraged and consoled people. So he persuaded, he also gave comfort. Then the next one, if it is contributing to the needs of others, let him give generously. So giving. If we share our possessions, if we share our time, our money, or talents with other people, we should do it in a generous way. Paul himself talks about giving generously, that we are to be a cheerful giver, and that we are supposed to enjoy ourselves when we give to others. And I know that some will say, and it includes as well, like giving to the poor. And I know that some will say, well, there's some folks who sit on their fannies and don't do anything, and we understand that. But there are also persons who are trying their efforts best to make ends meet. and doing all what they can possibly do and still are poor. And this whole notion and about prosperity gospel, it is no way that I believe that everybody will be prosperous. No way. Because Jesus himself told us in the Gospels, we have the poor always with us. So when you have that, how can everybody be prosperous or everybody be rich? For me, that's not going to happen. If it didn't happen in Jesus' time, he could stop it and he could make it happen. It certainly ain't happened now. So we need to be given to people who are poor and to be cheerful about it.
So charity doesn't begin at home? No.
Nah.
I have a question on the prophecy that was
The prophecy, okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's telling the future. I mean, do the priests tell the future? Or?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Prophecies take place all the time. Prophecies take place all the time. Where well, I mean, yes, it is a kind of a future thing. But what I'm saying is that you can get a message from God. God can tell you something, and you share it. That is prophecy. That is prophecy.
Okay.
That is prophecy. So it isn't to say that we have to wait till the future out there, some distant time. Prophecies happen where, as I said before, the more you have a relationship with God, the more God reveals, and therefore, and don't think of prophecy as it has to be big and glamorous and whatever. Prophecy is just God revealing to some person, and he expects that person to carry out.
So if you listen to it, then okay.
And you gotta also know the art of listening, of course. But if you usually have a relationship with God, you will be in tune with that as well. So that is possible.
That's how thanks.
Yes. And then he says here, if it is leadership, let him govern diligently. And here, he's looking at church leaders should carry out their responsibilities eagerly and so forth. So there is that if you're leading in the church. And if it is showing mercy, let him do it cheerfully. And here again, Paul comes back to talking about caring for the sick, the poor, the aged, serving the needy, and doing it cheerfully. Don't think that it's a chore or drag or whatever. And as I also say, and I always try to make a difference. I know we use the word mercy and compassion interchangeably. We use one or the other or whatever. But for me, mercy and compassion, there's a difference to the two. We can have compassion for someone, but do nothing about it. We could feel in our hearts, oh, I'm sorry that this person feels, or this has happened to an individual, but we don't necessarily have to do anything about it. That is compassion. Mercy, on the other hand, is feeling that, but also putting it into action. So, for example, the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan felt for the man who was alongside the road, who got robbed, and he had compassion for him. But he didn't only stop there. He took the man and took him to an inn, and that's where he showed mercy. Just to mention that. So when it says, if in showing mercy, let him do it cheerfully. See the word do, because mercy is a doing thing, and therefore the expectation is that you will do it, whatever it is, you do it cheerfully and not think of, oh well, why do I have to do this? That is not what Christians should be. Okay, any questions before I go into the next section? Everything self-explanatory? Beth, nothing today?
It's very heavy stuff. I mean, right? It's really very profound. I mean, I guess that's
it. But I want you to realize, Beth, it is heavy stuff. or may call it heavy stuff, and that is true. But the thing about it is that one, it is not totally impossible stuff, while at the same time, God does not want us to say, oh, I can't deal with this, I can never do this, and throw up our hands in the air and forget about it and go on living our lives the way we feel like living. At least, I think my God that I serve, which is the God that you serve, that we all serve, would want to see us making an effort to achieve that. If you're a teacher, you get something for effort. Well, I think with God, if we make the effort, if we strive for that, we are on the right track. It is different and better than just throwing our hands in the air and saying, no, I'm not going to worry my head about that. I can't achieve that. We need to be going towards that goal of achieving that.
I guess in my mind, it's a balance too. It's in that, some of the statements or some of the things that, that you've made where our gifts are always to be used for the benefit of God and others. At the same time, though, the right attitude with God requires right attitude with yourself. There's always, and Jesus talks about this, and Jesus does this, where he goes off by himself and has his quiet time, has his meditation. So one has to be able to take care of oneself before they can provide benefit to others. I mean,
Exactly.
maybe that meditation time is a benefit for God too. I mean, that's how you get closer to God.
Exactly.
But that taking care of oneself is necessary, it would seem.
Exactly. And you see, the thing about it is that we live in a time and in a world, I mean, not only in this time, I'm sure it was happening in times gone by as well, is that we become so busy that we don't take that time for ourselves, and we need to take that time for ourselves. We should be praying at least once a day. We should carve out the same way you can carve out for other things that we think are important. Why is this not important? And that is where taking care of ourselves comes in, because that's important. Once we could take care of ourselves, then we are better able to understand and to engage in worship in the way we should, because we have a better relationship with God. And when we come together as a community of faith, we are able better then to thank him. And then also too, we have a better perspective on others, because it's all tied into the same. Once we improve in our spiritual lives, then everything else starts to have a different take. There's a change, there's a transformation that is taking place within us. And so we have a better understanding. If we don't, and a better understanding of the gifts that we have. If we don't have that, is then we lose sight of what our purpose is in life. Some person will say, well, but that seems to take too much time. And I will say to them, but don't you take a lot of time to do other stuff? You can go and do other stuff for a lot of time and you don't have a problem with that. Why then does it become a problem when it comes to God? And then at the end of the day, when all else fails, who do you run to and hope that will help you? The same God, not all the different things that you were doing in the past. So why not make God primary in your life, in our lives? And that is where we need to that's the point that we need to get to, and to realize, what? I'm coming to you, Susan, but to realize, what? This is important for me. This is important for my spiritual welfare, my spiritual well-being, and therefore carve that out in our daily lives. Don't wait for something to happen then to start doing it, because that's what happens. Something happens and there's crisis, we can find the time to ask God to help us. We could find time then. But once it's in a crisis and everything going sailing along and doing well, God, I ain't got the time for you, man.
That's what do they
So-
say in trenches? There's never atheists in trenches, right? Not anymore.
Yes. So that is, you need to realize that. Yes, I am Susan.
Oh, well, I just like the way that it kind of makes you feel worthy because, you're all important. We all have a place. We all have gifts. So it makes me feel more worthy of God's love because we do all have a purpose and we have strengths, we have gifts. And so I like the way that
Of course, we all have a purpose, and as I like to say, and once we are still breathing and seeing and walk and doing stuff, not even if you don't even have to be walking. Once you're still alive on this earth, there's still a purpose. Your purpose has not been completed, and you still have a purpose. You still have a purpose.
Sometimes you don't feel worthy, but you are.
Well, and that is true. And that is true, but. And in fact, I might say to you, I might say maybe it's a good thing not to feel worthy, because then if you felt that you were worthy, then I think that's a problem too. Personally, but that's only my take. Okay. I think that's a problem.
Good.
Okay, all right. Let's move on to the second part. Now, the second part now starts at verse 9, where it seems like if Paul, you're getting a little bit like how Paul speaks of what we call the love chapter in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, where he says, love must be sincere. And he says here in verse 9, love must be sincere, hate what is evil, cling to what is good, be devoted to one another in brotherly and sisterly love, honor one another above yourselves, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serve in the Lord, be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer, share with God's people who are in need, practice hospitality. And here, what Paul is getting at, and he's here referring to the Christians again in Rome, in the church in Rome. And what he's saying, and he's giving them now some real different ways of how we are to exercise this love. And he's first and foremost saying that Christians are like a family. Christians are like a family. So, it isn't about, we come to and as you always realize, I always say the church building. I always write in my thing church building, because the church is us, the people. We just have the building, but we are the church. And so it's not about coming to the church building and worshiping and saying, and maybe talking to a few people and going home and saying, well, that's the end of that. Don't have to care about them or anything till the next Sunday or two or whatever next you come back. That's not what the church is. The church is a family. And so it is like you going home, you may have gone out and then you go home to your home and you go home to your family. And you behave as a family, or your family may be scattered all over the world, but at the end of the day, you're still a family. And that's how the church is. The church is scattered all over the world, but even those who you may not think is your brothers and sisters are. It's not only those that are All Saints, the people at St. Mary's, the people at TC3 Church, the people at the, whatever non-denominational church. All these folks are the people at St. Matthew's, Bloomingdale. They're all our family. We are all brothers and sisters in Christ because we have one head who is Jesus. And that's who we are united under, Christ. And therefore, we all are family. And so as family, we are called to love each other. Yes, like family, there's some that we wish that we didn't have, but we don't get to choose. And I said that last Sunday. The same way we don't get to choose them, we don't get to choose the ones in the church either. They're all our family. We don't get to. Yes, Linda.
I've got the I don't know what version of the Bible I have, but Revised Standard Version.
Mhm.
Could you read in your version 11 through 13? Because what I'm reading doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
11 to what does yours say, if I may ask?
It says, do not lag in zeal, be ardent in spirit, serve the Lord, rejoice in hope, be patient in suffering, persevere in prayer, and contribute to the needs of saints. I'm not sure what be patient in suffering and contribute to the needs of saints. What is that? What does he mean by that?
Contribute to what you said?
To the needs of the saints.
Oh, to the needs of the saints. Okay. And practice and then what's the last one they said?
Extend hospitality to strangers. Now I can figure that out.
My translation says, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord, be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer, share with God's people who are in need, practice hospitality. But we're going to get to that. Don't worry about it. We'll get to that. And this is actually where as I said, Paul is talking about loving each other, and the word for love in this case is that word agape or agape, which is the kind of love that God has for all of us, and it's the kind of love that we are expected to share, which is that kind of love where we wish no harm to anyone, and we love every person. It's not to say it's the love that you may have for your spouse or the love that you have for your brother or sister or your best friend, but it is that general love that we have in our hearts, and it should come really truly from our hearts, where that love benefits everyone. But now we realize that what Paul is doing in that short paragraph from verses 9 and following, he's given us really and truly 12 12 factors of how we are to be and how this love is to be exercised. From right down from verse 9 to verse 16, Paul is showing us how this love is to be exemplified by Christians in our lives and towards others. The first, he says, it must be sincere. In other words, it must not be pretentious. It must not be fake or full or artificial or superficial. It is not an act we put on, that Christians are to be genuine in the love that they share with others. So we're not to pretend to love each other. We are to genuinely love each other. So love is to be sincere. Then he goes on to say, hate what is evil, cling to what is good. In other words, things that are evil is straightforward. Everything that is evil, we are to dislike that, but we are to love the things that are good. And it goes into that whole notion too of sin and on all of that. That we are as Christians are to desire greatly to love all good things, but not to love the things that are not good, that the things that are evil.
Isn't it hard to hate what is evil, but not the person that's doing it? I mean,
I used to come along hearing a saying that when you probably heard it, you hate the sin but love the sinner. That was a terminology. Have you ever heard that? You've never heard? You've never heard that, Linda? Yeah, you hate the sin but you love the sinner. And there's some truth. There's truth in that. Although I think that the way sometimes it was placed, it was put, it almost made you feel as if you also hate the sinner too. But what Paul is saying here is, yes, things that are wrong, things that are evil, we are to say no to those sort of things. But at the same time,
we're just down the road from Buffalo, so that guy that went and shot up. Yeah, I mean, that is pure evil, and it's really hard not to hate the person that committed these acts.
But that's not what we're supposed to do. But yes, but I can understand that. That is true. Then we see in verse 10, Paul says, be devoted to one another in brotherly and sisterly love. So that's the third aspect. we are to love other Christians, which I was talking about, our brothers and sisters, because we are all part of one spiritual family. And therefore, regardless of where we are around the world, or whatever denomination we are in, even although we may have different beliefs in certain aspects, the major thing is that we have one head, who is Jesus the Christ, and that is what is important. Honor one another above yourselves. Again, we Christians are to be humble, and they should think well of others and to give honor to others. You know, we are not supposed to be patting ourselves on the back, but instead pat others on the back for what they do. Let somebody else pat us on our back, but don't think that either, because you may not get pat on your back. So don't think that. But really and truly, we're to be patting others on their backs, not patting our own selves on our backs. And then in verse 11, you see, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Again, Christians are to work hard in their service for the Lord. We are supposed to use our energy, to use ourselves in terms of service to God. You've heard me say this over and over and over and over, and you'll probably hear me say it over and over and over again, with my grandmother, who used to say, you want to become a priest? Boy, there's hard work in church work. And there is a lot of hard work in church work. But we are to work hard in service for the Lord. Then in verse 12, Paul writes, be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. And here what Paul is saying here is, and this is true for you to Linda, is that we are to one, always live in hope for his coming again, hope for future glory with the Lord. We live in hope that God will, that what God has promised, he will keep. That is, and what we believe, and we hope for that. We are patient in affliction, in other words, patient in suffering, that we may endure suffering, but we need to be patient because glory will come in the end. Reward will come in the end. And as we know, many Christians suffered throughout their lives for Christ. But we need to be patient when we suffer. And we also need to be prayerful. We need to be faithful in prayer. We need to be a people who are a praying people. Paul tells us, I don't remember if it's still Romans or another one of his books. He says we are to pray without ceasing. You know, I told the others this morning that when I was a seminarian in seminary, the bishop used to come by periodically and check on us and talk with us and all that sort of stuff and have lunch with us. And he had this knack for coming up to me and saying, well, Anthony, when last have you prayed for your bishop? And I will say, I prayed for you this morning at morning prayer, my Lord. And he will say, but don't you know Paul say you're to pray without ceasing? You should have prayed for me a couple seconds ago. I'm like, yeah, right. but you know, Paul tells us that we have to pray without ceasing. In other words, we need to be faithful in prayer, not sporadic or when we want something from God, but we are to be daily in our prayer. And then in verse 13, we see, and he gives us 12 of these things, you know, there are 12 of these things that Paul gives us. We are at number 7 now. In verse 13, he says, share with God's people who are in need. In other words, go back again, share with those who are poor, that we are supposed to do that. And you see that happen if you read the book of the Acts of the Apostles. You will see that the Christians used to send gifts when there was not enough food for Christians to have. And that was something that was happening. So it didn't now start. This was happening back in biblical times. If you read Acts chapter 11, you will see that was happening. 8, practice hospitality. And in those days, when Paul refers here about practicing hospitality, in those days, people will be traveling and they didn't have anywhere to stay. And what Paul was saying to the Christians there, open your homes to strangers, to other people to stay in your home. Now, I know we will say, well, I don't know if I want to do that right now in today's day and age. But at the same time, that does not still mean that we cannot practice hospitality, that we cannot be there and there for people and to welcome people and so forth. So and I'll tell you, because and even Paul speaks about entertaining angels unaware when we practice hospitality. And I don't know if I ever shared, I don't remember if I shared this story with you all, but I shared it this morning at the class, which was a perfect example of practicing hospitality and you don't know who you may be entertaining. And this happened to me where I had this lady, the last dean of the cathedral in Georgetown, Guyana. He had a cousin who wanted to come to Barbados. This is when I was living in Barbados. So this is like 20 years ago, over 20 years ago. He had a cousin who wanted to come to Barbados for vacation, and he called me up and he says, can you house this lady? And I said, yeah, sure. And at the time I wasn't married yet or anything. I had just freshly ordained. So it's almost 30 years now that this happened. And she came and it was nice. And man, I enjoyed having her because every morning I got up, I had breakfast prepared, and she always cleaned the house and had lunch for me and dinner for me when I come home. And she was really nice. And she spent 3 weeks with me and then she left. And then years later, she wanted to come back, and I had already moved here to the United States. And I said to the dean then, I said, oh, she could stay with my parents because she'll stay with me. She's met my parents while she was with me. And so she can stay with me. And so she stayed. And then one day, my mom wanted to show her our family album, pictures of us and all that sort of stuff. And when she looked into the album, she saw a particular man and she said, oh, that's Mr. Haynes. And my mother said, I beg your pardon? She said, yeah, that's Mr. Haynes. And my mother said, yes, it's my dad. And my mother, the lady said, your dad? But he looks everything like a man in Guyana named Mr. Haynes, who is my husband's uncle. And lo and behold, it was my grandfather's half brother who he had never met.
Wow.
So you never know who, and by that time this happened, my grandfather had died. But this man, which was a younger brother, was still alive. And so here was it that this woman spent 3 weeks with me in my home and not know that she and her family are related to me. And it evolved out of when she went to stay with my mother, my parents. And the thing about it is, the shocking thing is that although they were half brothers, they looked so alike that she can tell that he looked like my grandfather. She thought it was her husband's uncle. Wanted to know why he was in the album, but it was my grandfather, my mother's father. So I say that to just say, you practice your hospitality. You don't know what you may be doing or what could happen or what can come out of it. So.
Excuse me, Father.
Yes, Lorraine.
I'm losing audio a little bit.
Oh, you are? Are you hearing me better now?
That's better, yeah.
That's better? Oh, maybe when this drop. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
but no, don't worry. You are free to interrupt me if you're not hearing me well. Just tell me, because
I'm raising the volume here, but it's not doing any
no,
good.
that's all right. That is okay. If that happens, just tell me, Lorraine or anyone. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Then the ninth one is in verse 14. Paul says, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. In other words, we need to bless those who insult us, who speak bad things about us. Don't get upset, don't attack them, don't do anything bad with them. As my mother will say, leave them to Jesus. And but you are to bless those who insult you. Verse 15, rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. In other words, just sympathize with other people. And that's what a church should be doing. When someone has done well, achieved something, we should be rejoicing with them. If somebody is grieving, we should be grieving with them, because because they're our family. Remember, family, they're our family. Verse 16, which is number 11, live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud. Wait a minute, hold on. Oh, yes. Live in harmony with one another. In other words, live in agreement with each other. It doesn't mean that you will always have the same opinions, but you should try to work together with the same common purpose, the same common goal, because we all serve Christ. And that is the end result. That is the benchmark, is that we are serving Christ. And then in the rest of that verse 16, it says, do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. In other words, don't put people in categories that, oh, you treat wealthy people one way, you treat poor people the next, or you treat people in high positions, what we determine as high positions one way, and people in what we call lower positions another way. We are not to judge other people by wealth or importance in society. So and the letter to James speaks about this, where he talks about if a wealthy man came in to the church with all this gold and everything jingling from him, how will you treat him versus the man who is poor and wearing tacky clothes and raggy clothes? How would you treat him? And so and someone said this morning at class, well, that would not happen in All Saints. And I said, I'm glad to hear that they will all get treated the same way. So the thing about it is that, and what James was saying is that they should both receive the same welcome, but really and truly, in fact, that they normally do not. And so that's what he was saying. Then in the last section of this is verses 17 to 21, and Paul is speaking here about how our attitudes are toward our enemies. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live peaceably with everyone. Do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And I will tell you honestly, it is very, very hard to do that, but it happens. It does happen. Because if you start treating some person who dislikes you and hates you, and you continue being nice to them, it drives them crazy. Because it drives them nuts, because they want to know, what kind of fool are you? I don't like you, and you're still being nice to me. And it drives them nuts. So much so that eventually it happens that they have to reduce the hatred they have towards you, or just get out of the, or just leave completely, because what you're doing to them, it drives them nuts. And here Paul says it's like heaping burning coals on their heads. But in essence, Paul is saying is that we are not to refuse to do what is right, what is wrong, but we are to show that our actions, we are to refuse to do what is wrong, but we are to show with our actions the things that are good, that we are to be good, and that we are not to attack. Again, you see this repeated again, where he's saying Christians are not to attack. We're not to hurt others, whether they are our loved ones or our enemies. That God is the only one who has the right to punish actions, not us. And that's the point that Paul is trying to say. So if an enemy receives kindness, he may be sorry for his actions. People can change. So that is what we are supposed to do. We are not to hate someone or persons who hate us. We are to go higher and to show love.
Unless you work in customer service, when you get When you work
In customer, I mean, I am
Customer-
sure in customer service, every day you go, there's some people you wish you could smack, but the fact remains is you don't.
how do you, yeah, they don't turn them around and be nice. They're still, yeah,
You know, so
I'm
you know,
kidding.
you don't be nice, you lose your job.
Linda's daughter's in customer service.
Yes. Any questions? Any questions?
No, I agree with that last part, though. I've had personal experience where I've had to have a long-term relationship with someone who is very difficult and
Mhm.
hateful.
Hmm.
But in the end, they turn around and they look at you finally differently
Hmm.
and realize what you're about. And they
Mhm.
actually say, thank you.
Hmm. And yes, and I have had similar experiences as well. I mean, you know, you cannot be a priest as long as I have. I mean, when you're a priest, you're dealing with folks, and everybody is not going to like you, and that is fine. Um, um, but you cannot, as a priest, for example, express yourself in a way that some folks who are not priests would express themselves. So you still have to show kindness and tolerance and
Well, otherwise you're going to compromise who you are.
exactly.
If you
And it
treat
should be
evil with evil, then you're
exactly.
compromising not only what God wants you to do,
But what
but
you
you're
want to do.
compromising who you are as a person
Correct.
and as a Christian.
Correct.
Yeah.
And it should not only be for priests, it should be right across the board. But it is, but it is hard. It is hard to do. But that's what we are called to do. That's what we are called to do. Yes, Marilyn. But you're right, Linda.
I was at a funeral yesterday, and where someone gave in a eulogy a couple of paragraphs called "My Train." I don't know if anyone else has heard this, but it kind of is a common sense way. I heard this yesterday, and it had a big impact on me. And then when I read the readings again for tonight, it kind of is a down-to-earth way of looking at things. So if you want to bear with me for just like 3 minutes, I'll read it. It says, at birth, we boarded it. At birth,
I'm hearing some. Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
At birth, we boarded the train and met our parents, and we believe they will always travel on our side. However, at some station, our parents will step down from the train, leaving us on this journey alone. As time goes by, other people will board the train, and they will be significant. For instance, our siblings, friends, children, and even the love of your life. Many will step down and leave a permanent vacuum. Others will go so unnoticed that we don't realize they vacated their seats. This train ride will be full of joy, sorrow, fantasy, expectations, hellos, goodbyes, and farewells. Success consists of having a good relationship with all the passengers, requiring that we give the best of ourselves. The mystery to everyone is we do not know at which station we ourselves will step down, so we must live in the best way. Love, forgive, and offer the best of who we are. It is important to do this because when the time comes for us to step down and leave our seat empty, we should leave behind beautiful memories for those who will continue to travel on the train of life. I wish you a joyful journey on the train of life, reap success, and give lots of love. More importantly, thank God for the journey. Lastly, I thank you for being one of the passengers on my train.
Wow. That is powerful. Is that something you could send?
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Please. That is very powerful. That is almost. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying when I heard it yesterday, it was my best friend's husband's funeral, and I just felt completely drained after going through everything, because I went, and she lives just a few doors down from me here as well as in Jensen Beach. And I went to her and I said, I don't know how you are feeling, but I said, I'm exhausted. No,
yes.
It was just such a powerful.
Yeah, that reminded me of, you probably may have heard about the Dash.
Yeah, right.
Um,
I've heard the dash. I just hadn't heard the train before.
Yes, I have not heard of train either, but there's one called the dash. And the dash is when you die, you have the year you're born and the year you die.
Yeah.
But the
And it's
major
what's in
thing
the
is what
middle.
happens
Yeah.
between that part that is the dash.
Right.
And
Right.
it sounded similar to the dash, but quite
Yeah.
still different from the dash, actually.
Right, right.
Quite different from the dash, but a similar kind of thing to the dash. But if
Yeah,
you would
I'll
send
mail
that
it
to
to you.
me,
Yeah.
that will be great, because I would love to have that. Those sort of things I think are powerful, and sometimes I get to use them in sermons and that sort of
Yeah,
stuff.
but
So
it
that
kind of
is-
goes along with what we're saying tonight, like, to be,
Yes. Yes, we are called to be the best we can be in this life, and that is important. It enhances the way we worship God. It enhances the way we love Him. It enhances our relationship with Him. It also enhances our relationship with one another, and that is what that's what we should all be striving. It's not easy, and I'm not going to tell you it is easy, because it's not. But you have to make the concerted effort. It's the same way there are things that we have to do. Sometimes we have to go to jobs, and it ain't easy either. But the fact is, we make the concerted effort to do the best we can. And so that's all God wants from us, to do the concerted effort to do the best we can.
Yeah, you don't want to be one of those people that when you leave, that they don't realize that you've left.
Yes. Oh, they're gone? Oh, okay. You don't want that. You don't want that. Any other questions? Well, we took longer than I expected. So, but you also had a lot of questions. So you see, this chapter, it had a lot of questions coming out of it this morning, that people wanted answering to share. And they already told me, because we had already read chapter 13 this morning as well. They said, Father, come prepared. There's more coming out of that one tomorrow, next week, because it has to do with how we are to respect authorities. How we just respect the state. so I said to them, that's the only politics you'll ever hear from me.
That's pretty hard, authority.
If you read chapter 13, you'll see it all there.
That was our parents. Right? Yeah. Our parents were the first ones on the train.
The governing authorities. That's Fall's spiel for next week. All right. Well, if no more questions, it's lovely to see all of you. Susan, nice to see you, and glad that you're much better. Marilyn, you have gotten back and everything is good. So I'm glad to see that, and everybody seems doing well. So those who are still in town, or those who live permanently in town, I'll see you on Sunday.
Yeah,
Love you all. And Pam, thank you as always. Thank you as always.
we do listen every Sunday.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Thank
God
you.
bless everyone. Have a good night. Bye.
Bye.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.